I'm artist Andrew Denman, and thanks for joining me for another chapter of acrylic painting with Andrew Denman. In this installment, I'll finally get started working on the White Tiger. We'll go over some of the basic mechanics of how to effectively paint fur in acrylic, and I'll also introduce you to an unusual technique blending pencil and paint. First, it's time to remove the mask from the tiger silhouette. Next, I realign my study to the board. In addition to my registration marks, I cut out extra alignment markers to make absolutely certain that the tiger's features transfer where they should. In this process, precision is of the utmost. Very carefully, I realign my existing registration marks. Some are hard to see due to previous glazing, so, using a hole punch and masking tape, I punch out and apply dots over the existing markers for added accuracy and visibility. It's a tiny adjustment, but it helps to ensure that the study I labored over for so long is transferred exactly as I intended it. Using a hard lead pencil, such as a 6H, I carefully retrace all of my interior lines, using sufficient pressure to ensure a quality transfer. It's worth remembering that it is the lines I apply now that will make their mark on the actual board. When I remove the transfer copy, I'm left with a clear, readable roadmap to begin painting. But before I go any further, I should give you an idea of what the next several steps are meant to achieve. In this piece, entitled The Green Tunnel, I've used the same technique I'm about to show you now. The acrylic color is painted opaquely or glazed over a detailed underdrawing, then partly sanded off. Here, here, and here, to achieve a subtle fade out. In this piece, Morning Light, this elegant effect allows less important areas of the subject or composition to be present without being overly assertive. Again in the Challengers, where the horses secondary to the action fade gracefully into the white of the page. In this piece, my goal is different. Conceptually, I'm using the creation of art as a metaphor for the creation of a family, such as that of the commissioner, and I want the tiger to look like it's emerging from a drawing into real life. The hindquarters will remain a drawing and transition into sharply painted, full-color detail at the head. My tools are the surprisingly versatile No. 2 pencil, a 4 and 6H for details, and an ebony pencil for rich darks. From the shoulders on back, many of my pencil marks may show through in the finished piece, so it's important to partially erase the transfer. I want to leave my guidelines faint but visible. Then begins the long and careful drawing process. I take care, even in the early stages, to direct my pencil marks in the direction of the fur. The No. 2 pencil lays in the groundwork. I use a Q-tip to soften the blending, then enrich the darks with an ebony pencil, and sharpen the details with the harder H pencils. Of course, a pencil drawing is vulnerable to being smeared, so I'll have to seal it. I mix together Liquitex matte medium and gloss medium in a 2/3, 1/3 proportion, thin with a bit of water, and brush it on. There is precious little time before the medium dries, so this must be done quickly. I keep the sheen even by applying it to the entire piece. It's a bit anticlimactic, but I also seal my signature at this time. A quick, vigorous scumble with a large, dry brush kills the brush strokes and leaves me with a beautiful, glassy surface. Now we're finally ready to start painting fur. Liquitex Hooker Green Deep Hue Permanent and Napthal Crimson make the basis of my black. Pigmentary black doesn't exist in nature, so whenever avoidable I prefer to use this substitute when painting nature or anything organic. It's also a lot more mixable than a tube black, creating much more active grays and beautiful neutrals. Rich burnt sienna, creamy bronze yellow, and vivid cadmium yellow DPU make up the warms. Then, of course, there's the ever-useful and versatile titanium white. Inky dioxazine purple and luminous cobalt blue round out the cool side of the palette. This is my standard palette. You'll note that there are no greens. Typically, I don't have an actual tube green on the palette unless the piece has a particular abundance of green, but if I need it, I can always add it. Otherwise, it's simply mixed from these colors. I'll need a bit of water, and also a healthy dollop of water on each bit of paint. Next, I suck the water off with a scrap of paper towel. I don't want my paint to be soupy, I only want to leave a thin film to keep the paint hydrated. Armed with my study and any relevant photo reference, it's time to start painting. I'm actually going to start with a moderately small flat brush, but as I progress, I'm going to be relying more and more on these script or liner brushes. The shafts are slender and I wrap them with shelf liner or vet wrap for ergonomic support. The two below are brand new and suitable for fine detail. The two above have seen some wear and tear, but are still great for the finer parts of blocking in and some targeted glaze work. I don't use anything smaller than a number 1 brush. Size of brush is less important than a well-maintained fine point, and I try to avoid anything so small it holds frustratingly little paint. Using primarily my black substitute and dioxazine purple, I begin laying in the darks. Then the medium values. The main goal now is not to try and paint hairs, but to preserve the underdrawing and anchor rudimentary values. As the detail begins to develop, the liner brush becomes key. You'll also note that at this stage I'm deliberately downplaying highlights, which results in a very gray-looking tiger. As I move past the shoulder, I make an adjustment in the palette. I trade in my red-green based black substitute for tube Mars black. Though again, I prefer not to use a true black pigment, everything behind the shoulder may be exposed to sanding, and in my experience, my black substitute can look very purplish when sanded, and I need the sanded areas to stay neutral in hue and color temperature. Because I know much of this will be sanded away, I'm being more minimal as I approach the rear of the cat. I've abandoned white altogether, and I'm being a bit less precise in my detail. The more confident I get in anchoring the anatomy, the more detail I build, always being careful that the direction of my brushstrokes follow the direction of the fur and benefit the illusion of volume. The most important key to successfully painting hair is viscosity control. The paint must be just thin enough to glide on smoothly, but thick enough to maximize opacity. Aim for the consistency of thin syrup. As the head progresses, edges are softened, details tighten, hues are refined, but most significantly, contrast finally emerges. One of the first mistakes aspiring realist painters make is to be too quick to add highlights. Highlights must be built up to gradually if they are to communicate a convincing sense of volume, rather than appearing simply pasted on. But of course, I'm not finished here. Using a fine silicone sandpaper, the kind used in automotive bodywork, usually between a 400 and 1500 grit depending upon the situation, I carefully and partially sand away some of what I've just applied. It may seem crazy, but I've found no shortcut for making one of these fade-outs appear genuinely organic and spontaneous. Sometimes it requires a lot of effort to make something look like it just happened. I may have exposed some of the graphite again, so I'll need to reseal. Next, a bit of careful, targeted, opaque brushwork in the main transition zone helps this blending of styles look more seamless. It may not even show up on camera, but I'm a stickler for details. I've noticed that the white of the back end of the tiger, which is the gesso ground showing through, is warmer than the opaquely applied titanium white of the tiger's front end. Using a very thin yellow ochre glaze, I slightly warm up the head and shoulders. This very transparent yellow ochre by Winsor Newton is highly useful for glazing, as is their burnt sienna, which I'm going to use for some targeted glazing on the tiger's head using a very small flat brush. As subtle as they are, these glazes have a big impact. More obviously here, where I introduce some non-objective color. Keeping with my theme, I want to give the impression that this half-painted tiger is being colored in by the spilled paint he will soon be walking through. The nearly fluorescent phthalocyanine green and manganese blue, two colors I typically avoid, are just what the doctor ordered here. Same goes for a mix of Liquitex quinacridone magenta, dioxazine purple, and Winsor & Newton permanent rose. In those areas where I glaze past the edge, a damp Q-tip cleans up nicely. Targeted glazes with an old liner sharpen up details. Once again, a light, careful sanding softens the effect and creates beautiful, improvisational textures. The colors I use to paint the sky and clouds make a comeback now as I soften and clarify edges. Nothing quite destroys the illusion of depth and volume like a hard edge. The glaze work done, it's time for finishing details. Using a mixture of my black substitute and dioxazine purple, I make a rich, velvety, dark value. Applying the paint sparingly and semi-transparently, my goal is to punch in the lowlights to activate darker areas and sharpen up details. Next, it's time for the highlights. I add small increments of cad yellow DPU to my titanium white. It's important to clarify that I don't want to mix a soft yellow, simply a warm white. Even a faint difference in color temperature will cause the warmer brushstrokes to advance visually, to pop. It's important not to overdo this step either. Brushstrokes should be fairly opaque and remain individuated, as it is the contrast against the cooler background that will create a successful highlight effect and contribute to the sense of texture and volume. Go too far, and it all goes flat. Lastly, it's time for the whiskers. I move the piece to my drafting table where I can firmly plant my wrist for stability, and use a 4x magnifying jeweler's head loop to save my eyes from straining. As in the rest of the piece, contrast starts out low, with the whiskers appearing grayish. A thin, syrupy consistency of paint, a steady hand pivoting off the pinky, and a finely pointed brush are key. To be successful, this must be done with unerring confidence. Hesitations and false starts will show in the quality of the line. Once again, I switch to a warmer, brighter white to add highlights. It's here where number 1 liners prove their mettle. Their precision allows me to retrace an existing hair-thin brushstroke exactly, while their long bristles, which hold much more paint than stubby number 1 rounds, can paint a longer, continuous, unbroken line. We've moved from a silhouette to a drawing to blocked in. We've built up values, detail, and contrast. We've sanded, glazed, and clarified darks and highlights. Thanks for joining me. Tune in next time as I tackle those paint cans. We'll cover a lot of important techniques as we explore how best to approach miniaturist detail.